As we move into the second part of this first unit, the first part, of course, we talked about skeletal muscle, which you guys all know I'm slightly biased against as a skeletal muscle physiologist. But as much as I hate to admit it, skeletal muscle is a dumb tissue. It's dumb because it can't really do anything on its own. So it only contracts when it's told to contract. And so that's the impetus for the next part of this first unit, which is why we lump them together. So that's the organization and structure of the nervous system, which is going to do all of our control of a lot of things. So one of the primary responsibilities of the nervous system is to maintain homeostasis. Right? This is the idea of the ability that an organism has to maintain equilibrium, or essentially keep all functions kind of leveling, hovering in a normal position, right? And it can do this by adjusting to any physiological process, right? So the idea is the ability to detect changes and respond in an appropriate manner to those. Right? It's essential that we have our proper neuromuscular function in order to be able to do that. So how do we do it? First, let's look at neurofeedback. So we have two different types of feedback systems in the body. Right. These are essentially again, as we mentioned in the previous slide, our ability to detect and respond. Right. This is the communication between the nervous systems and the organs. So if we detect a change, we can then respond in that appropriate manner and then alter the function of the organ system that it is innervating. So we have two different types. We have one that's called a positive feedback loop. So this is seen in the very top image there with the A and B in the circle, right? This is something that where a small response will actually intensify a process and make it greater. If we think about examples, the classic physiology reference that I think most textbooks, or if you just Google positive feedback loop, what they're going to talk about is they're going to talk about pregnancy and having birth. Not necessarily related to this class, but it's still a great example. The idea is that as a woman goes into labor, there will be release of certain hormones that will then cause an even greater increase in hormones and an even greater increase in hormones. And that's why contraction strength builds from a nice small contraction into heavy contractions just before labor and allows birth to happen. So that's your classic positive feedback loop. Throughout the semester, we'll see several examples of this. Another example of this would be looking at something like metabolism. When we get into metabolism, we'll see that certain molecules, when they increase, they will cause an increase in metabolism. For example, as we talked about in muscle contractions, we know that we use ATP for those muscle contractions, which generates something called ADP when we take that phosphate group off. That ADP will then increase metabolism to help make more ATP. We'll get into that in the next unit, but just kind of setting you up, giving you two examples of a positive feedback loop. Overall, I would say positive feedback loops, while they are prominent in physiology, the actual feedback loop that is most common and most used is a negative feedback loop. And this makes sense from a homeostasis point of view. Homeostasis point of view is something gets out of equilibrium, therefore we detect it's out and we respond by doing the opposite of whatever happened in order to get us back into equilibrium. So negative feedback loops are going to be really important in just maintaining equilibrium. So the idea is that there's a diminished intensity of a process in return to get the body back into the status quo or getting it back into equilibrium. So this is illustrated by the bottom picture here where we have an input that causes some change in A, right? That change in A then causes a negative feedback on B, which then inhibits A to kind of get us back into equilibrium. Again, I would say this is the most common. So a non-physiological example, the one that most textbooks that you would kind of look at would say that this works like a thermostat in your house. Right? So if the temperature, if you have it set, I'm cold-natured, so we keep our house nice and hot. We keep it in the upper 70s. We'll go with 75. So if your air conditioner is set on 75 during the summer, when the temperature in your house gets hotter, so say it gets 76, 77, what happens is that air conditioner will then come on, blow cold air to negate the warm air, and getting the temperature back down to 75 degrees. Right? The idea that we got out of homeostasis, we have a negative response that brings it back down into the range in which we want. Negative feedback feedback loops important for physiology. I would say positive feedback loops really important for exercise physiology, and we'll see several of those in the future. So as we look at that, so now we have our ability to detect and respond. What are the actual structures that are going to be doing this? Of course, the nervous system, the key component of the nervous system, is indeed the nerve, right? The nerve can be broken down into several different components, right? We will start with the first one. It's actually second on the list here in the video, but the first major component is the cell body. Right, the cell body essentially contains all the major parts that normal cells have. Another name for the cell body is called the soma in nerves. Right, this nerve will then contain, again, all the major vital things such as the nucleus. It'll contain our Golgi apparatus. It'll contain our mitochondria, all of the things that are necessary in order to maintain normal function of this cell. Right? Another key component of the of a neuron is the dendrites, right? The dendrites are on top of this picture as it's labeled here. And what these do is they are able to receive inputs from other nerve cells, right? So they are kind of the listening part of the nervous system or of the neuron. So they listen to signals from other neurons that can then send information back into the middle or the soma, the cell body of that neuron. So dendrites, their main function is to listen and send signals back to the cell body. We then have an axon, and this is our deliverer. So we have our listener and dendrites and our deliverer of the message, which are axons, and these send impulses from the cell body to another neuron or target tissue. They do these via action potentials, which we'll cover in the next class period. Right, so we'll send impulses from cell body down a neuron. They also have very specialized parts of the cell in order to speed that through. We'll have a video on this later on, but just to kind of introduce you to the concept and how these work, you'll see that the axon in itself is surrounded by kind of fat-like tissue. So you can kind of see right here that this is our Schwann cell that kind of covers in over the axon and kind of creates this nice little fatty bubble. Right? You'll see that it's kind of looped so that we have these intermediate nodes. These nodes, if you're from Texas, I use the term nodes of Ranvier, but I think the proper French pronunciation would be nodes of Ranvier. Either way, we're not an English class, so pronounce it however you feel. If you got the thick Texas draw, go for Ranvier, right? So what it does is these allow for something called saltatory conduction that allows to kind of jump between nodes and really speed up the process of sending an action potential down the axon. Right? The last part, again, is the axon terminal or the synapse. Right? So you can see in the bottom of the figure here that these look sort of like dendrites, but these aren't actually collecting any information. What they're doing is they are innervating or connecting to, the proper term is innervating, but you can use simple vernacular and just call it connecting to the organs, right? So we send a signal into the terminals, which then innervate the effector organ to then cause there. So in this picture here, of course, we have our skeletal muscle, as we're talking about this in the neuromuscular unit. So it's able to talk to the skeletal muscle and, in this case, tell it to contract or potentially get signals, right? So again, if we kind of look at this from a top-down perspective, we have the dendrites, which collect a signal. They then kind of integrate all these signals together into the cell body or the soma. The soma then will then send a message via action potentials down the axon, which is covered with Schwann cells, or which make something called myelin, that fatty region that then goes all the way down to the synapse. Right? So that's kind of your basic structure of the nerve and how the majority of the nervous system is going to communicate. Right? If we think about what does a neuron look like, again, that first picture is just your global view. This is out of your textbook, and I think this illustrates a really great point, is that all nerves actually have a little bit different look to them, and it's all based on their structure and function. So if we look at this really big one in the very top that kind of looks like a tree, labeled 5 from your textbook, Right? If we think, okay, what might that be something for? So again, at the very top, you see this kind of tree-like looking structure. Those are all the dendrites, which then connect to the cell body or soma. And then you can see it has a very long axon, which then has a very small axon terminal or synapse. Right? My guess would be this would, of course, be to the brain. Right? The idea that we have all these synapses talking to each other in the brain. Another interesting one that would be something that would be a little bit different would be, let's say we can take the one just to the next of it, which would be number 6. Right? Number 6 doesn't really look at all like that first picture. Right? It has dendrites at the top, and then it has some more dendrites out to the side of the cell body, and then our axon and axon terminal then at the bottom. Right? So if I had to guess, or taking a look at what the structure and function of this would likely be something that, of course, would be taking input from 2 different sources. Right? So you have dendrites collecting information at the top, and dendrites probably collecting information from somewhere else in the body or nearby that are kind of surrounding that cell soma. So indeed, this is a nerve cell for the eye, and the idea is that eyes are able to use both rods and cones in order to detect different colors and be able to see appropriately, and so they need to have input from 2 different sources. And so just as a thought process, this would be the neuron of an eye. Again, the idea is that neurons are going to look all a little bit different, and their structure is going to match their function. All right, so now let's talk about types of neurons. In general, we can classify them into 2 types of neurons, especially for this class. Right, the types of neurons we have are sensory and motor neurons. Sensory neurons are going to carry message from the sensory receptors back to the central nervous system. Another term for sensory neurons that you can add to your notes as you're watching this is afferent neurons. Afferent neurons, again, are the ideas that they carry message from sensory receptors, whether that's in skeletal muscle, when we talked about muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. Again, those have afferent neurons carrying information back to the nervous system, or in the effector organs, or anywhere, right? Anything carrying back to the nervous system. The other is motor, or you can also call them efferent neurons. Efferent neurons are important in carrying messages, indeed motor control messages from the nervous system into their effector organs, specifically from central nervous systems to muscles. As we can imagine, these have a cell body in the spinal cord and a long axon that then will go in and innervate the muscle fibers. They have short dendrites, of course, to receive impulses from other neurons. So again, our structure matches our function, and in our neuromuscular unit, we can kind of describe and kind of think about these long axons innervating muscle fibers, short dendrites, not necessarily a ton of them because we don't need a lot of information like we do in the brain. So the last part that we'll talk about is we've gone kind of top to bottom, starting at the nervous system all the way down into the synapse. The synapse is the point of connection and communication between 2 excitable cells. What we mean by excitable cells is cells that can undergo action potentials. As we know and have mentioned, nerve cells are able to undergo action potentials, which is just a change in voltage. Skeletal muscle as well can undergo muscle action potentials with a change in voltage that we'll discuss in detail later on. Right? So when these 2 cells connect, how do they do it? What they do is they get really close together, as this kind of picture shows. They get relatively close together. The terminal axon comes in, as you can kind of envision in your head, that they kind of split out into different innervation sites, right? And they can communicate via these small gaps. These small gaps are called the synapse. Specifically, the gap in between the 2 excitable cells is called the synaptic cleft. And the way that this works is the action potential will travel down the nerve, and then we'll get to the terminal axon near the synapse, and will cause a release of some type of neurotransmitter. Right? A transmitter that is sent out from the nervous system. A lot of times in the neuromuscular system, as we're concerned, this would be acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is released from the first excitable cell, or the nerve in this case, into the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is relatively small. right? So it is able to get across that cleft relatively easily. It then binds to its specific receptor on the other side and will cause some type of response. In skeletal muscle, the response, of course, then is the muscle action potential to then be transmitted through the sarcolemma of the skeletal muscle in order to cause it to contract. Right? And so that's the way it works. Again, signal through an action potential comes down the axon, causes the neurotransmitter to be released from its little vesicle, which is kind of the round little circle there holding the small little dots. That vesicle is released into the synaptic cleft. It moves across that tiny little synaptic cleft, binds to a receptor, and then causes an effect on its effector organ. So that'll wrap us up here for kind of the basic structure and function of the nervous system. What we're going to get into in the next video is looking at the brain and how we ultimately control all of this.